ultimately, we are all subject to capitalism in terms of how we view our bodies. I mean, the best example, I suppose, of capitalism creating a body, in a sense, is Bonnie Bloom,
Mm.
you know? And she's
For those who don't know, she's the famous porn star, right? Who did like a viral documentary or something about basically having sex with like 100 men in a day or something.
Oh, I think it was more than that. I haven't watched it, and because I really find it really, really sad and disturbing. And also it's sad and disturbing that she doesn't find it sad and disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
And look, I mean, I know people jump up to want to analyze her or pathologize her or think about what type of trauma she's endured or whatever. And that's the different question. But I mean, you could say, well, she's a sex bot, isn't she? She's sort of like the ultimate implacable being that doesn't have any affect, doesn't have any feelings, can just be a receptacle. And, it's just a purely sort of capitalistic exchange. The more that you can have sex with, the more money you can make. And you basically treat yourself like the ultimate entrepreneur of the self. She is occupying this complete Zen-like position of total indifference. It's like, I'm here, you can come and do whatever you like, and the next day I'm going to get up and I'm going to be exactly the same. It's not going to have any effect on me whatsoever. And there's something in that is extremely chilling. It's not just Bonnie Blue, it's the tragedy that these men are queuing up, and they're boys as well, young boys. They're queuing up thinking that somehow, some way, being involved in this makes them a man and makes them worthy or makes them have something good and makes them, the fact that they've been able to do that to her, to subjugate this woman has made them. And so that you can see there is no sexual relation here. There is no sexual relation. What she thinks she's doing and what they think they're doing are completely at odds.
I mean, one debate I've seen take place in feminist circles is the kind of anti-sex work view versus the sex positive view. I mean, personally, I just tend to more side with the Marxian oriented ones who are critical of sex work for this very reason. I can see the argument for decriminalization, for protection and all that, like that made sense. But there's also this weird push, which I see, which is to say, well, what's fundamentally immoral about it? We already do these other bad things. But I find it very hard to frame sex work in any sense as a liberating thing, given that it's like the sexbotification of women, like in the most literal sense. I mean, you said it yourself, like Bonnie Blue's sort of become the incarnation of like a sex bot to all these men.
Mm-hmm. Look, the actual reality of the fact that doing sex work is, no doubt about it, going to have tremendous psychological effects on the people who do it. And it goes without saying that that's mostly going to be women who are being used in that way by men. So yeah, I mean, I'm not a sex positive person in that way, because I just think it's so naive to think that sexual liberation entails complete and utter access and freedom for everybody to do everything wherever they want, because of course that's not how sex works. It never was like that.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like, you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with Dr. Isabel Millar, philosopher and author of the book Psychoanalysis, The Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence, which I believe was based on your PhD dissertation, correct?
It is literally my PhD dissertation. There's basically no difference between the two manuscripts, actually.
It's a pretty damn cool subject to do your PhD on.
Thank you.
And I first came across this maybe like 3 years ago or something from a YouTube video that you did on one of my friends' channels, Artin Salimi. Shout out Artin Salimi. It was really cool, that collaboration. And I picked up the book and I hadn't actually read it for like years. And it wasn't until really like getting into just learning about ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, and all this world, the kind of explosion we've seen. And that kind of reinvigorated my interest into this. And yeah, there's just so much here that's still very relevant. And we're going to be talking about that, psychoanalysis and AI. And don't worry for the people who come here for the politics, which is a big portion of the audience. Some are the theory heads who come for the Todd McGowans or for the theory heavy episodes. We're going to try to keep it accessible. And it's going to be relevant. I think it's going to be really relevant to a lot of what we're seeing now. So first and foremost, I mean, just give us a little pitch about like what your book's about and what made you want to write it. Because, I mean, you wrote this before a lot of this kind of AI mania that we're seeing now that really took off, I would say, in the past 2 years.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me anyway, Tony. It's nice to meet you. I mean, I whenever explaining why I wrote the book or how I wrote the book, it's difficult to not immediately descend into sort of abstract and weird Lacanian terminology, because I was doing a PhD in Lacanian philosophy and psychoanalysis. So the sort of interest for the project is somewhat abstract as opposed to just a general interest in artificial intelligence, because actually I wasn't that interested in artificial intelligence when I began my studies, because I was, I was doing philosophy in the beginning, and then it sort of became more psychoanalysis. And so AI became a sort of vessel through which I could articulate what I believe to be interesting questions and sort of new questions that were pertinent to our times. And, as anyone who's done a doctoral project will know, is that you start out with certain ideas and what you end up with is often very different from how you begin. So the reason it sort of developed into this specific thing of artificial intelligence is because through lots of exposure to clinical work, or we had the luxury of being lectured by sort of practicing psychoanalysts from the New Lacanian school, for example, among other people who were sort of giving us clinical material and talking about developments within the Lacanian clinic. And so to be hearing and reading this along with obviously the Lacanian texts and Lacan seminars, and sort of to see it live, as it were, the sort of development of Lacanian ideas in the field of the clinic, whilst studying philosophy and sort of post-war French thought and all of the kind of thinkers who come up in that era. Of course, Baudrillard, and of course, Foucault, and of course, many other people who are related to that kind of whole canon, D&G, etc. To have these sort of two fields at the same time in my mind, the sort of practical clinical, but also the kind of big theoretical questions that somebody like Baudrillard was talking about in terms of reality and the sort of dissolution of reality and all of the grand changes that supposedly he was laughed at for thinking about in the 80s. So it started to sort of coalesce around trying to think about the philosophical dimensions to some of the things that were happening civilizationally or clinically to human beings with bodies speaking sex subjects. And so through beginning to think about that, usually via fiction, via film, this central concern around artificial intelligence developed because it seemed to be the sort of most extreme way of trying to think about the new in psychoanalysis, the new things we have to think about, and the new problems, the new questions of the body and the question of sexuality, which psychoanalysis has always been concerned with, but which now I think there are definitely sort of majorly interesting and new questions that we should start to tackle. So that was how it kind of began.
Yes, that somewhat answered one of my follow-up questions, which was, why psychoanalysis? Because a lot of people are interested in AI, but there's a lot of people who still dismiss psychoanalysis as something unscientific. And why not just have engineers understand AI? Wouldn't they be better equipped? And I mean, this is not just, laymen dismissing it. I mean, even I find Noam Chomsky to be quite unnecessarily dismissive of psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
But you talk about in the book certain ways in which people get AI wrong because they get the human condition wrong. What can psychoanalysis offer when understanding the human condition that has a direct effect in the way we understand or misunderstand artificial intelligence? Because we see right now, on the one hand, a kind of Promethean obsession in Silicon Valley in the tech world with AI, AGI being able to become conscious and whatnot, and kind of on the other side, this sort of, dare I say, use a Lacanian term, probably not in the right context, hysterical overreaction when it comes to AI replacing humans, right? And this sort of anti-Luddite, this sort of Luddite anti-tech reaction. So
Yeah, I mean, so this is again the question of how the project began, which is that what you immediately come up against when you're tackling the sort of broad question of AI is how completely unprepared and qualified most people, and we are in general, to start theorizing about artificial intelligence. And why? Because there's so many assumptions involved in this concept, which A, is not properly defined anyway, because it's an umbrella term for lots of different things and an ongoing research project. And B, because it gets to the very conceptual roots about what we consider to be A, intelligence, and B, consciousness, and C, obviously subjectivity, which is not even a word that would come into most of the purviews of the people who are actually talking about artificial intelligence. So immediately once you start saying, oh, artificial intelligence, we know what it is. Well, hold on a minute. Do we know what intelligence is, first of all? So, you have so many strands within this problem, which you can start pulling at. And, one, what intelligence is, how the concept has emerged over history and how it's changed politically and scientifically according to different paradigms. And two, most sort of philosophically and importantly is how do we so easily elide the question of intelligence with consciousness and with thinking, and which has been the abiding philosophical concern, for centuries. So that, of course, you immediately have this very rich territory where, of course, it's a dimension for philosophers to talk about. And of course, it's a dimension for psychoanalysts to talk about, because it's immediately invoking this enigmatic question about what human consciousness is. So it's very quick to see, well, the sort of the charge of, for example, you mentioned people slugging off psychoanalysis because it's not scientific. That's the whole point about psychoanalysis, is that it questions the very idea of what science is. What would a science be that included psychoanalysis within it, was one of Lacan's famous questions from Seminar 11, where he is basically addressing non-psychoanalysts and people from the scientific world and philosophers and people like that, and saying, what is the status of psychoanalysis? Because the argument that it's not scientific is really a sort of non-argument, because that's very much the point of what he's interested in, is trying to get to the position of psychoanalysis sort of in relation to philosophy, in relation to science, in relation to literature and fiction and fantasy, and all of the different, obviously, dimensions that Lacan invokes, which are manifold. So, it's already so like loaded, the kind of the array of questions that you can sort of unfold with AI, and the idea that the people who had been mostly talking about it, certainly when I wrote the book, which was 2020 actually, because that was when I submitted my PhD, it was mostly AI people and people who really had very little interest in questions of human subjectivity, humanity, the development of the consciousness of human beings. Like they don't know, so they weren't interested in that. So it was very much sort of open goal, isn't it? Like, well, people need to think about this because they're not thinking about it, and the thing still remains today. This is still, it's not been very long, but it's still the point that there's so much thinking to be done about this big, massive question that people are throwing around and making lots of sort of scare tactics about, which are based on, things that are very much more to do with the consolidation of power around who controls AI, as opposed to genuine questions of what AI can and may be able to do in the future.
Yeah, we seem to know more about the external world than we do about ourselves, which kind of, it seems to really lead to this sort of uncritical view of, well, it's an uncritical critical view of AI that doesn't self-reflect on the human. And there's a lot of ways you flip this discourse on the human. And one of those things is, among what you just mentioned, intelligence.
Mm.
In the book, you deal with like the way we understand intelligence is itself very, debated, and that itself, intelligence, is not like thinking, all what thinking is. You talk about the stupidity of intelligence. Could you elaborate a little bit on the way you see this word intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, so intelligence is obviously quite a sort of a new concept, actually. And I mean, the idea of measuring intelligence with IQ tests, for example, is just one way that we can immediately see the sort of eugenicists' beginnings of the idea of intelligence as being tied to certain traits and certain measurable qualities of the human being. And we don't need to think very far to see the obvious racist and sexist problematics around the idea of IQ tests and how that all began. And there's much literature on that has been explored around, the beginnings of the sort of racist beginnings of AI. But also, this sort of question of how the notion of intelligence relates to thinking is an important one, because we have to make a distinction, for example, between what thinking is and what we consider to be a subject. Because arguably, you can have thinking without a subject. You can have a sort of intelligent machine that doesn't have a subjectivity, that doesn't have, we in sort of psychoanalytic terms would call a split subject, So the idea that those two things are coextensive is not so easily thought, I think. So, an obvious example is in new materialist thinking and sort of like object-oriented philosophy, the idea that certain entities are agental and they are intelligent and they can make decisions about things, and you can also see that as in like swarms of animals and swarms of ants that can decide to do something, so they're forms of intelligence, there's forms of thinking that aren't the same as subjectivity. And so that split is again something that is not always thought about when you're discussing what AI means and what the idea of sort of artificial general intelligence could mean, because thinking and consciousness are very different, and they also don't necessarily understand what the body is in relation to intelligence. So, I mean, the idea of certain forms of intelligence being so easily replicated by AI is, of course, problematic, because, we think that, oh well, because a computer can do so much with numbers, they're so much more superior to us, and there's this exponential ability to deal with certain forms of data, which of course makes human beings look very puny in comparison. But that's just one form of thinking, and that's just one sort of way of sort of metaphorizing what the human subject does with data. And it doesn't really fully capture what's happening with speech, for example. and how speech is related to thinking. So yeah, there's many ways that we sort of come up against contradictions between those concepts. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because people often say, "Can AI think?" And that was a big doubt. And then now you see these agentic abilities of ChatGPT and Claude, where they can like think, and they show the process by which they reach conclusions. But it's, of course, in this very kind of logical way, but it's not in the way humans think. And
Yeah.
part of the big thing you do in your book is flip the question from, instead being, whether AI can think, but can AI enjoy? Why is that a far more important question for you? And what does the enjoyment mean in the psychoanalytic sense as opposed to pleasure? We've talked about it before in some episodes, like the one I did with Todd McGowan,
Yeah.
and some way back before that as well, with Cadell last, actually, who you've been on. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is inevitably a sort of technical question that gets into all sorts of Lacanian pitfalls. But essentially, the reason why I swapped that question around and wanted to ask, the question of not thinking but enjoyment is because it's precisely enjoyment which is at the center of theorizing human subjectivity for Lacan. And what that means is the way that in which we structure our subjectivity comes through language. And language itself is, for psychoanalysis, a form of enjoyment. And that's a very, very simple way of trying to explain what jouissance is, what enjoyment is. But for psychoanalysis, you have a sort of progression of this concept that has changes and has various different sort of paradigms throughout Lacan's teaching. And I won't go into all of them because it's probably not helpful. But I think what's the best way to try and think about it is to remember that we are born as these sort of helpless creatures who are we're just our bodies, okay? And we don't have language yet, and we're totally dependent on our primary caregiver, our mother, to give us all of the immediate things that we need, right? But this idea of need is immediately sort of confused because it gets imbued with all of these other sort of signifiers that are coming from our caregivers, right? So we need milk, or we need warmth, or we need a hug, or whatever. But our caregiver doesn't know what it is we want. We're just trying to communicate something to them. And immediately what they do is they try and talk to us. They try and give us something. They come with the breast, the milk, whatever, the bottle. And that sort of satiates us to a certain extent, of course. So there's a certain immediate biological need, but we don't quite know if that was the right thing. We don't, nor the parent, nor the child. So there's this sort of gap between this immediate sort of demand for something and the thing that you receive in order to fulfill that demand. And so what's between those two things in psychoanalytic terms is what we call desire. So this sort of gap between the demand and the need and the fulfillment of that need, there's always this sort of strange liminal dimension. So
feel free to break that down, by the way. We don't have a no jargon rule. It's only no jargon without explaining rule, right?
yes,
Or it's like,
okay.
of course we understand what that means, right? But like, yeah, desire, drive, that's like a crucial thing, I think.
Yeah. So this is what I mean is that you quite quickly get into what seems like an easy question becomes difficult, because actually, it was never a throwaway thing to say, why talk about does it enjoy rather than does it think? The reason why it's not throwaway is because what it does is it opens up the whole panoply of what Lacanian psychoanalysis is trying to get at in terms of the body, in terms of thinking, and in terms of language and enjoyment. Because let's remember, those are all things that are entirely crucial to our thinking about artificial intelligence. But if we just park that for a second, forget about artificial intelligence, and what about human beings? Okay, what about what is this thing that is born not being able to speak, with a body, with needs, And then suddenly those needs are mediated by obviously the physical intervention of the caregiver, but also the language that is used to try and draw out what it is that this thing needs and wants. So if you think about it as a sort of this transition between when the child first starts crying out, right? It's a material utterance, right? You don't have a word, but you cry. And at a certain point, the cries become words, right? So they become something that can be repeated. They become signifiers. They become something that is recognizable to somebody else and can be abstracted from this sort of material utterance. So you immediately pass from a sort of plane of sort of immanence, as it were, of being, you're just this blob being and like screaming and whatever, to suddenly being able to say something and repeat it. And that repetition brings you into a sort of different realm. It brings you into the realm of the symbolic, right? Which in psychoanalytic terms, the entrance into the symbolic is how you become a subject, is how you become a speaking being who, through this sort of negotiation of the sort of Oedipal triangle between mummy and daddy and me, how do I get myself into this sort of subject position of a human being who speaks and has an identity, right? And so once you start having to mediate this through language, something very strange is happening, because all of these things that were immediate to you become separate from you, and they enter into a sort of dead realm of repetition, right? So that's language, that's the symbolic. It's there before we're born, but we have to enter it, whether we like it or not, in order to be human. So
the discourse of the other that we're socialized in, right?
Exactly. The discourse of the other, which we have no choice about before we're born, what country we're born in, what the social mores are, what ideas of sexuality are, what the politics are. We don't know before we're born what they're going to be, but we're born into them and we have to negotiate them. And so all of those sort of battery of signifiers that are going to be present in obviously immediately with the mother and father or whatever configuration you have at home, is going to be forming the way in which you enter into society, into language, into the symbolic order. So with that, okay, so this process, which we call, the sort of so it's the Oedipus complex from Freud, but when we talk about castration, we're literally talking about what happens when you negotiate language. Okay, it's castration, because ultimately, why is it castration? Because you can never say what you really mean. You can never say what you really want. It's structurally impossible for the scream of the child to be the thing. Because what is the scream of the child? It's basically attempting to reintegrate itself with the plenitude of, the pure oneness with the mother or the breast or whatever, right? You can't get that back. So this structurally is how you become a speaking subject. So once you understand that through, psychoanalysis, it really changes the way that you understand what a thinking, speaking subject is, what intelligence is, because you have this strange negotiation where you have to come away from yourself. You have to enter into an abstraction. But that abstraction is a strange one because it involves the body. And these sort of marks upon the body, i.e. I say marks, but I mean this sort of metaphorically, in the sense of how language is marking your body in terms of like making it into a body, giving it zones, giving it significance, are really making you into a sort of a sexed subject. And when I say sexed, I mean make you either a man or a woman or a non-binary person, right? It's still a sex subject. You're still a sex subject, whether you identify as a man or woman or neither of them. We're all sex subjects because we have to be placed within language. Okay. So this is how this kind of question of why psychoanalysis is relevant for thinking about AI, because it's already showing us that, well, hold on a minute, there's so much more that we need to do when we're thinking about our relationship to language before we even get to talking about AI, because there's a body here. And this is what psychoanalysis is essentially important to understand. And to come back to your actual question, which was, about enjoyment. Enjoyment is the central concept of psychoanalysis because you can't enjoy without a body. And if you have a body, you enjoy, and there's no way around that. But of course, enjoyment is not such a nice concept as we all actually know. It's something that causes us lots of problems, and it's not something that we can just, I'm enjoying this is nice. No. It's something that we want, but most of the time when we have it, it becomes too much and we need less of it, or, something along those lines. And of
It's
course,
desiring, right? As opposed to pleasure, which is the release of tension. Enjoyment is characterized by tension. That tension that involves desiring unmet desires, whereas pleasure is like a kind of release as opposed to pleasure, which is that sort of how it is?
yeah, I mean, Lacan doesn't really talk that much about pleasure, to be honest. I mean, the thing is that, if you think about enjoyment as a sort of scale, it's a sort of scale that you're always trying to sort of ascend, but of course you quite quickly realize, actually that's too much, and I need to come back down. And life is filled with lots of iterations of realizing that you can't have too much of a certain type of pleasure because it's not going to end well, and being a sort of, if you want to, being normative about it, being a well-adjusted person is knowing how not to enjoy too much. I mean, essentially, when you enjoy too much, you end up, dead from a heroin overdose, for example. Or, the thing about when you actually do take a specific type of enjoyment to its nth degree, it's monstrous. It's horrific. It's something that you actually really don't want. But yet we think that enjoyment is this lovely, pleasurable thing. But actually pleasure and enjoyment are quite different things. As anyone who has, any type of food problem or obsession with any activity or any addiction knows that enjoying something is very scary and always needs to be mediated by desire, which is a sort of endless deferral of enjoyment. And yes, the drive is basically the sort of non-human impulsion to follow to the nth degree enjoyment despite what you need, right? Despite what's good for you. So it's the thing that you will continue doing even if it kills you, whether that's smoking or eating or having sex or whatever. It's the thing that you will keep doing whether your body can take it or not.
Hence the term jouissance, which is like pleasure and pain.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
That painful part is that. So it's like we think of, because I remember once trying to explain this to a friend, and I was thinking like, I think you actually enjoy getting stressed about this. And they were thinking, well, how I don't enjoy it. This doesn't feel nice. But they would always find things to feel stressed about, or like very particular, like neurotic, like I need to, this thing came out. It's just, it was their kind of way in which they got their enjoyment, and everyone has their different way. And another way I like to think about it, and maybe this is an example perhaps of a very big difference in the way humans and AI think, is so like, why do we do what we do? Why do we work hard on things? It's not just because like we desire it, because sometimes we desire certain goals, but we always sabotage our desire so we can keep desiring. And the way in which that process of desiring, and you're like enjoying getting there, and that can be very different for different people. One of my friends, Michael Downs, he's very prolific writer and very prolific just, despite not going to having formal university. And I was asked, how did you learn all of this? And some people attribute a kind of mystical, like super intelligence to him. And he's like, no, this is just where my like psychic enjoyment is geared, is to constantly learning about this stuff and being frustrated with not knowing enough.
Yeah.
Whereas AI is just like, think, goal. It's a very linear, one-dimensional sort of thinking. The difference between how our enjoyment affects our thinking and the way we do what we do versus AI. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, so for psychoanalysis, there is no thinking without enjoyment, essentially. it's a central part of the very form of knowledge, and the different forms of knowledge that we can have are all based around different configurations of enjoyment. So yeah, so Mikey is never gonna stop writing as long as he's enjoying it. That's the way it goes. Yeah.
Why do you think so many people are afraid of AI replacing human labor, given that we're so different in how we do stuff? Like, what seems to be the case is people are afraid of AI replacing like artists or replacing writers, lawyers, even. You know, could, from your point of view, could this be more of a problem with the way we look at what we do as humans than as it's a bigger indictment of maybe the mechanization of humans as opposed to AI becoming more human-like?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a problem that we've had for much longer than the sort of very immediate, obvious kind of encroachment onto certain professions that has come about through the ChatGPT and other LLMs and things like that. I mean, this problem of how do we value certain forms of human creativity or human thinking is a question that has roots much further back and relating to, and of course was the concern of people in the Frankfurt School, and was very much the question of what is happening to human thinking in relation to technology writ large. And I mean, the obvious thing to say is, well, yes, there's going to be lots of replacement of certain types of human creativity. But the question is, which parts of those are worth replacing and which parts of those are worth keeping? Because in a sense, you could say, well, the fact that you can now have programs that will just write film scripts for you and create endless Netflix dramas, which we already have. Does that mean that we're not getting any good ones anymore, or that we just can't tell the difference anyway? And so we'll just watch these crap ones that an AI has written. And the problem is that this is a question of judgment and a question of criticism itself within the world of, art, within literature, within film, within the plastic arts, is that how do we consider what something is, whether it's good or whether it's not good, whether it's art or whether it's rubbish, whether, this question, I suppose, has been brought back to the surface because if AI is doing all of these things, what is the status of the things that it can do in the same way that we can do them? And what makes them human as opposed to AI? When someone's written a terrible script, for example, and an AI could write just a terrible script, what's the difference? Is one more worthwhile than the other because a human made it? I mean, this is, I think, part and parcel of this whole problem is that with AI, what you get is just a sort of acceleration of lots of sort of forms of degeneration of human thinking anyway, because it's part of the culture industry. And what it does is it makes us stupid. The sort of process of proletarianization, in the sense that we lose capacities, not just sort of physical, technical ones of knowing how to make stuff, but we also lose capacities to judge. We lose capacities to understand things because we are not doing the work ourselves. We're outsourcing it to something else. And so this is a sort of negotiation that we have to take into account all the time. But the problem is, what kind of dominates these debates is not sort of nuanced questions of how to judge a work of art, but rather, oh my God, the AI is coming to kill us all and we're all going to be, killed by sex robots in our sleep. It becomes so banal, the arguments. And because the people who are dominating those arguments are the people who control the means of production. Of course, they're the ones telling us we should be scared. And they're usually telling us that because they know that covers over other important questions that we need to be thinking about. So, yeah.
You mentioned that you can't enjoy without a body, and that is a key part of the human condition for psychoanalysis. Probably the most convincing case that I saw in general when it comes to why AGI is kind of a fantasy and AI can't become conscious is because human is the theory of the embodied mind, which is human consciousness is marked by the fact that it's embodied. Like the body is such a big role in human consciousness that without that, the idea of like, AI having consciousness in anything remotely a similar way of that humans do is just unthinkable, really. Does that, to an extent, overlap? If I'm talking about I forget the exact two authors' names, but it's a pretty famous book, The Embodied Mind. And does that overlap a little bit with the Lacanian view that you employ when it comes to, enjoyment being just something like AI can't enjoy, but also, is it because AI can't have a body that they can't enjoy? Like that's kind of where I'm trying to ask is, does it overlap with this embodied mind theory? Because what if AI could enjoy without having a body?
I mean, look, the thing is that what are the stakes? Is if it can, then what are we talking about? I mean, the only reason why the question is interesting is because it makes you have to think about how language and the body are related and how they're not the same thing, but how they are a sort of strange structure that allows us to position ourselves within society, within subjectivity. It's a necessary condition of being a subject, right? But the reason why it's interesting that's why it's interesting to talk about enjoyment is because there's nothing like that we see with artificial intelligence. So when people are fantasizing about AI, they are fantasizing about things that don't exist. So, that's why in the book I write about fiction. I don't really write about anything that exists. I don't write about any real technologies. I write about films because in these films, you get to see what all of our fantasies are around the creation of an artificial mind and why that's so important to the discourses that are really creating AI. Because it's not just facetious to say, oh, well, let's examine, for the sake of film studies, let's examine some films about AI. No, it's really, the reason why it's important is because those fantasies really are what go into creating AI. They really are what go into our political ideas about AI, because we don't know what it is and we're making it up all the time. And the only way that we can have ideas about it is through fiction, because it's not a real thing yet. It's something that we're creating all the time. And it's an idea that is sort of intimately connected to what we think is human consciousness. And because we don't really know what human consciousness is, and we're still arguing between various different schools of thought between, of course, scientific paradigms and philosophical paradigms about what a conscious mind is, we're still trying to figure out now, okay, so what's AI then? Sort of like we're trying to do this thing when we haven't actually got the basics to understand what it is we're trying to imagine. So to talk about enjoyment, I suppose what it does is slow down the conversation as opposed to sort of accelerating it in a way, because it forces you to sort of try and like go, hold on a second, what is it that we're actually talking about? What are these fantasies about? And why are we so fascinated with this idea of a sort of omnipotent, omniscient form of intelligence that is either going to kill us or have sex with us or take our jobs or whatever, And so it's very interesting to obviously examine how those fantasies become sort of myth and become sort of folklore that we sort of articulate through film. And there's so, it's difficult to say, well, what is AI? Is it a fantasy or is it the actual reality of what we have? Because if you actually look at what AI is now in the world, it's pretty boring. LLMs, but they're not they're not human beings walking around fooling us. They've been here for a long time. It's a lot further back than we think, which is just because we're noticing it more. But forms of AI have been around for a long time. So yeah, I think the question of enjoyment is one that sort of puts a sort of break on a lot of the kind of this sort of puerile teenage boy fantasy of the singularity and of what it's going to mean for us when AI takes over and when we're these purely human beings, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, you can think like that, but in a way, you sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. If we're going to imagine this world, why do we care? Why do we care? If we don't care about what happens to humans and we just want them obliterated and just, all the accelerationist stuff, what's the point of thinking and talking about anything? What's the point of any of the history and philosophy and science that we've been doing and blathering on about? This is all we do. This is all that human beings do. We blah, blah, blah. We think about things. We make things. We make finer and finer and finer distinctions about what our conditions of existence are. So I think that when you get to a lot of this kind of bit bombastic talk about AI, it kind of knocks all this nuance out the window, and you just get a lot of sort of, I don't know, like locker room talk, to put it.
It's funny you brought up the accelerationist stuff, because Nick Land, who I've discussed with some other people, he sees capitalism and artificial intelligence as more or less part of the same broader process that he thinks is irreversible, inevitable. And he very much believes in the singularity. And I wonder, capitalism itself seems, as Marcuse wrote about in one of my favorite books, One Dimensional Man, really, it kind of roboticizes humans to a very, one-dimensional role, one-dimensional thinking that's solely in terms of instrumental reason, right? Processes. And I do wonder, the likes of Nick Land and people who believe in the singularity, maybe their own sort of thinking is so instrumentalized, and they've so much internalized this logic that, why couldn't humans just end up being, replaced by AIs who become conscious? Because if you have that view of consciousness that you take as a given, then it's not as hard of a stretch to imagine that, which is why I think it's not a coincidence, right? Where it's like the engineer types, the finance types are more likely to kind of really believe in this idea of AGI.
Yeah.
Whereas like people in more like the social sciences are more likely to be skeptical of it.
Yes, because people in the sort of positivistic sciences, they don't think about human subjectivity that much. They think it's a much more simple question. And, the idea that you can replace humans with robots seems to be something much more common sense to them, because they haven't really thought about how complex the question is in the first place. And, I just think that a lot of these assumptions are they're so puerile, because they, the idea that, well, AI can replace us, and so therefore, what's the point of us? I mean, it kind of ends the conversation, and you just sort of think, well, if that's what you think, there's really nothing to say. There's really nothing to imagine. If you think human beings are that simple, and it's this sort of apocalyptic thinking, it's sort of self-defeating. And yes, I mean, the Nick Land, capitalism and AI are the same thing. That's a theoretical argument that you can make, and I have lots of sympathies with it. But it's the other things that come with it that are just deeply silly in a lot of ways.
There's a lot of movies you talk about in your book, ranging all the way from Her to Ex Machina to Ghost in the Shell, all sort of Terminator, various depictions of artificial intelligence. Why are people so drawn to this idea, of like, well, they're all kind of different, right? You make different points about, but all of them seem to involve like a projection of a fundamentally human fantasy. How would you say that, like, in what way what does this say about us, basically? What is the way that humans depict AI in these science fiction films say about our relationship to it?
Well, obviously the central thing that I'm sort of drawing out in all of these examples is the sexual, and then looking in terms of sort of the non-rapport, the sexual non-rapport, which obviously we could go into all the sort of Lacanian technicalities of it, but we'll try and be not too jargony, which is to say that sexuality is a problem for human beings. And it's probably the most fundamental and sort of defining characteristic of the speaking subject, which is that sexuality is the sort of ontological or onto-epistemological structure of our being in the world. And which is that we don't really know what sex is. And because sex is a meaninglessness, it emerges through a strange kind of hole in knowledge, a sort of gap, a lack, impossibility. And for all of us, that impossibility, it's the same for all of us in the sense that we all have this impossibility, but the way that we negotiate it is different, and the way that we deal with it is different. And that way of dealing with it for all of us is what we would call sexuality. And sexuality comprises, of course, how we view ourselves, but also how we view others and how we want others to view us. And crudely speaking, this is what you could say is the fundamental fantasy for everybody. We all have a fundamental fantasy which structures the way that we understand reality. And in Lacanian terms, a fundamental fantasy is something that can be boiled down to sort of like a formula, a sort of positioning of oneself in relation to a sort of grammatical structure. Freud had the famous "a child is being beaten" structure, which is to articulate a sort of recurrent fantasy that he noticed within his practice, which is not just the question of who is the child, are you the child? Are you watching the child? Are you the parent? But it's this sort of tripartite function of the fantasy which structured all of our ways of articulating our sexuality. So, and Freud uses that one because obviously it relates to your early interactions with primary caregivers, but also how you view yourself in relation to others as you grow. And if we imagine everybody's fundamental fantasy to be made up of some sort of grammatical structure of the way in which we want to be viewed, or the way in which we think we are viewed, or the way in which we position ourselves with respect to others, we'll go about our lives within some sort of immovable configuration that determines every single relationship that we have. And that in itself is a form of, one could say, jouissance, but also suffering, because it's something that for all of us is sort of intractable, and it brings us to the people that we end up being together with, or not being together with, or falling in love with, or falling out of love with, or whatever. But it's what structures all of our intimate relationships. So, that's the sort of universal thing. But what is the kind of the gendered question of which that I focus on mostly in the book, is because the discourse on AI is, of course, extremely masculine, and our fantasies around AI are extremely concerned with feminine subjectivity and what being a woman is. And for psychoanalysis, the question of what is a woman is really one of the structuring questions of psychic life. So, famously, the hysterics question for Lacan is, what is a woman? And the obsessional question is, am I dead or alive? And very, very sort of crudely, we could say, well, most men are of the obsessional type, which is they're questioning, am I dead or am I alive, right? Whereas most women, if they're hysterics, are concerned with this question of what is a woman? Am I a woman? Tell me, am I a woman? And it's quite easy to see how most of sort of femininity is concerned with this constant question, this constant need to have it confirmed for you that you are indeed what people say you are. And when they say that you are that, then you say, no, I'm not that, I'm something else, you know. So it's this constant like need for the master's approval, but then the rejection of the master because the master doesn't know, right? So that's the hysteric. But if you think about that immediately with relation to artificial intelligence, I mean, we very much have this projection quite naturally of the kind of masculine and feminine positions with the very founding of our idea of artificial intelligence, which of course I begin the sort of analysis of AI with the Turing test, which is a way of establishing whether or not AI is, or whether or not something is sentient, if you can trick someone into thinking that you're human. And that is sort of depicted through the film Ex Machina, which I think is a really good way of dramatizing the relationship between masculine and feminine subjectivity, but mapping it on to the way in which that the character from Ex Machina, I'm sure most people have seen it, basically need Ava to exist. He needs her to be a woman for his own sense of masculinity. So he projects her femininity onto her, which is coextensive with her subjectivity. So he makes her exist by making her into a woman. And she is sort of brought into existence by him, you know, hystericizing her, making her think, well, what am I? What am I? What am I? And through this kind of negotiation between the obsessional and the hysteric, we kind of see how we begin to start feminizing artificial intelligence, but not just feminizing, hystericizing it, making it question what it is. And yeah, so that's just the beginning of the sort of way that I start entering into this sort of question of sex and AI. But there are other ways as well. Yeah.
I actually do want you to break down two Lacanian concepts that I think are so relevant right here.
Yeah.
And I have trouble understanding one of them. So, well, first of the one which like you did explain very well in your book, which is there is no sexual relation, Lacan's famous saying, and how that relates to sex and AI. The other thing, which is related to something else you brought up, the gender thing, this one I have questions with because I find it a little hard to understand, is like, didn't Lacan also say there's no female sexuality or something of that sort? Or I forget exactly how he worded it, but there's no such thing as female sexuality.
No, he didn't say that. He said woman does not exist.
The woman does not exist. That's it.
But the crucial bit here is he says the woman does not exist. You have to keep the because the is the thing that qualifies woman as a totalizable category. Mm-hmm. He's not saying women don't exist. He's saying the woman doesn't exist, i.e. the one woman that would be the definition of all women. Whereas the man does exist. Mm. So the difference here is a question of, and this is where it gets into sort of set theory and strange algebraic notations, but we don't need to do that. How we understand it is the man is this idea of a one, a man who can be the exemplar of all men. So you know, in culture, you very much hear it in lots of these things, just in the way that we talk about men and women. You're the man, you know, like nobody says you're the woman, right?
Yeah, and or you're like a son to me.
Yeah, exactly. It's we already understand this intuitively in the way that we approach the question of womanhood and question of manhood. Manhood is about being that man who is excluded from all the groups of other men, whereas women are in an open set which can't be totalized. So, you know, going back to Freud, Lacan builds these ideas off of Freud's, you know, engagement with myth and so, you know, the idea of the primal horde, so that, you know, back in sort of ancient mythical times, Freud talks about the beginnings of the prohibition of incest, right? And the beginnings of the makings of social groupings. So he talks about the primal horde and the totemic. So Totem and Taboo, we'll, I'm sure, recognize that title. So you have the community of men, and there has to be one man that is allowed to sleep with all the women, and he is the exception, right? But what binds all these men together is that they are all jealous of this one man that can sleep with all the women, and so, but they all have to like make a pact to like not kill this man, basically. But he's the man who is outside the group of all men, right? And so this idea of the sort of this phallic totemic figure of the man who is the ultimate virile creature, who, if he wants to, he can just like fuck the whole village, right? This seems like a ridiculous and sort of strange anachronistic thing for Freud to be talking about. But what Lacan does is extract the logic here and say, well, okay, but what's actually going on is that we're talking about set. We're talking about what makes you part of a set. And so to translate it through all the iterations it goes through, what you end up with is the idea of, you know, the man is the one that it can be excluded from the group. He is the exception to all the other men. Whereas being a woman, it doesn't have a closed group. It's something that you can't quite contain. So it just keeps adding new things to it. And seeing that in a sort of very kind of colloquial and cultural understanding and way to make it seem more tangible, you know, just look at the way that masculinity is much more codified. You know, being a man, you have to do certain things. Being a woman, you can do whatever, you can be whatever. And that's why when a man dresses as a woman, it's strange and funny. When a woman dresses as a man, we don't even notice it. Because being a man is very much more codified and restrained and kind of controlled. You have to adhere to certain things in order to be in the category of man. So those kind of banal observations just make you see the definition of masculinity and femininity are already like, they're not opposite. There's something else. There's something else here. There's a logic here that is different. But to talk about that in relation to sexuality of I think you asked what the non-rapport is.
Yeah, his saying there is no sexual relation, because you talk about that in the book. That's a big part of the whole sexual abyss chapter, I believe, or something.
Yeah. So I mean, and again, this goes through, you know, you can do all the technical algebraic stuff, but to be more like tangible about it, essentially the masculine position and the feminine position are sort of, they miss each other. They're not, they don't fit, yet there is this non-relation that keeps them being, if you're thinking in terms of heterosexuality, that keeps them wanting to know what the other position is, right? So a way of thinking about this is that when two people have sex, they don't understand what the other person is actually enjoying. They're enjoying what they're enjoying about that situation. They don't know how the other person is enjoying them. They only know that they are enjoying what they're enjoying, right? So this rapport doesn't exist. It's not a thing. But another way to understand that is that in a much more sort of abstract way, there is nothing that makes us naturally sexualized. The only reason that we have sex is because we are in language. The only reason we are sexual beings is because we are in language, right? Another way to say that is that animals don't really have sex, they procreate, right? They're not involved in all of the strange rituals and strange eroticizations of the world that human beings are.
They don't have they don't have fetishes and all
exactly.
that stuff. Yeah.
And so why, you know, what are those things about? Why do we have sex? Why do we have sex? We have sex because we have language. We have eroticism because of language. You can't have it without. It doesn't mean that you get it in, you know, you have to speak. You don't have to speak. But the point is that it's only through the entrance into this symbolic realm, which is an abstract realm, which cuts you off from the immediacy of your body, that you enter into all of these strange positions within language that make you gay, straight, whatever you are. Like, all of those particular proclivities only come about through the particular way that we enter into the symbolic. So in that sense, there is no rapport also refers to, there's nothing necessary about the way that we become sexual. It's completely contingent upon whatever particular like place and time that we're born in, and what are the mores of the society that we live in, and that all dependent on culture and language. It wouldn't exist without it. So in a sense, psychoanalysis is the only discourse that can actually understand what sex is, if you can say that you understand it. I mean, you could say, well, we don't understand it. It's completely inexplicable. That's another way to put it. But science doesn't understand it. I mean, science can't possibly begin to. So the idea that people try and say, oh, we found the secret to why men like doing this, I mean, those are just completely bogus, endless arguments you could always make. You found a new piece of research. But so what? It doesn't explain what is this weird thing that we do? Why do we do it? And what is it? And why does it cause so much suffering? And that's the other flip side of it, which is that actually, the sexual is the thing that makes us suffer more than anything else. It is the thing that beleaguers and terrorizes human beings, and very much, causes more of the problems that we can than we can imagine. It's at the heart of all of our political debates. It's at the heart of all of our struggles. Is the sexual realm, and it's strange because it begins within the very beginning of our lives in our family, and then it becomes this social nexus that we are then entering into. But you can't take those two realms separately. They're completely intertwined.
Some people who might take what you said a little too literally will say, well, of course, there's the biological drives. There's people get horny or whatnot. But like what you're saying is sexuality, the way in which we understand it, the way in which we try to codify it, put labels on all these things. That very much is like a fundamentally human thing that is a very poorly understood thing. And I kind of like to think about this through a little bit like Foucault's history of sexuality. What's really interesting is the way he deconstructs kind of like the myth of sexual repression. Because if anything, modernity is characterized by this attempt to try to like really understand sex and codify it in a way that wasn't before. And that's kind of, but it's such like it's a subjective experience that the idea of like a relation is anachronistic because it's so dependent on that person's subjectivity. Does that relate at all to, because like, this is this thing Žižek likes to say, and Žižek's where I got introduced to Lacan. I found Lacan to read directly, like very hard. Found a lot of us by Lacan very impossible to read. So a lot of us get it from Žižek, who tends to popularize these things. A thing I've heard him say a lot is Lacan's supposed quote that sex is masturbation with a partner or something like that. How does that relate to this? And also a follow-up with that. How does that relate to, this kind of rise of like AI girlfriends and AI boyfriends?
Yeah, I mean, I think that statement is basically underlining the point that you're always alone with your fantasy. There may be another person there, but your fantasy is still the same fantasy that you would be having whether they were there or not. And that's what he means by masturbation, in the sense that it doesn't matter, you don't have to be actually physically masturbating, but the point is that you're psychologically engaging in something which only you are understanding. You're not in a sexual act, both experiencing some sort of weird sort of sort of transcendental experience of the other person's sexual, you're still experiencing it through your own fantasy. Their fantasy and your fantasy happen to be compatible at that moment, but it's still your fantasy. So that's what he means by masturbatory, in the sense that you're alone. And this is very much, why the sexual non-rapport is central to our thinking about artificial intelligence, because we're thinking about something which we are imagining, we're sort of fantasizing about and trying to reach what it's thinking, or what kind of position it occupies. But in the same way that we can't really understand what that position is, because we can only ever go via our own fantasy. That's not to say this is not like some radical nihilistic thing about, we're just completely alone in the universe and we can't ever understand each other. That's not what it means. It just means that, you have to understand that sexuality is a strange and difficult thing that we've all negotiated through the things that have happened to us in our lives. It's not that we've been given some biological impetus that we've then in various ways interpreted. It's that we have literally all had a mother and, father, most of us, who has been occupied a certain position with respect to what we think we are, and how then we are kind of allowed to enter into the symbolic with the help of the sort of second person in that, i.e. the third, the father figure, whatever. How that has allowed us to sort of position ourselves has then been the beginnings of the way that we will later on experience ourselves as sexual beings. And that is basically what Freud was trying to get at, which is that you have to look at the child's experience to understand what a full-grown adult is as a sexual being. It's not to say that everything in the world is about sex. It's to say that sex is about everything. It's to say that what the concept of sex is so much more wider and deeper and conceptually rich than what we think it is, as like, something that you do when you're an adult and it's in a bed with a person. No, it's something that structures our whole way of understanding the world. And that's why it's such a difficult and terrible and traumatic thing, because it can so easily go wrong. And most of the time it does. And so that's why it's very little understood. And you said before, or some people would say, oh yeah, but you've got you just get a biological, urge, and then that's it. And it's like, well, actually, you only get a biological urge through the mediation of language. I mean, that's the strange thing about sex, is that it's, what makes you find different parts of someone's body interesting, or different parts of your own body respond, is because of language. It's because of the way that you have entered into the symbolic. I mean, we're not just speaking about language, of course. We're thinking about the symbolic as a realm of laws and prohibitions. So it's broader than just actual speech and language.
That brings us to a very, very interesting conversation, which we're going to talk about in the second half of this podcast. It'll be Love in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, related to these exact themes, which you can get access to in the Backroom on Patreon, which if you're not a member of already, you should absolutely become a member. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Any last things you want to plug, where people can find you, work you have coming out?
Yes, I mean, I have finished a book. The book's called Politics, and it's coming out with Bloomsbury, hopefully in the new year. And that will be touching upon some of the things that we've talked about, but it's essentially a book which kind of draws on the sort of heritage of Foucault, Agamben, Membe in terms of biopolitics and necropolitics, and develops a concept of politics from the Latin patio, to suffer, in that it kind of looks at the sort of condition we're in now, which is one of not just a sort of administration of life or death, but an administration of suffering and enjoyment, and the body under these new sort of strange conditions, which of course are a lot conditioned by artificial intelligence, but that's not the whole picture. There are other things going on. So yeah, so that's the next project.
Awesome. Anyways, hopefully the listeners enjoyed. You can leave a like, comment, 5-star rating, and check out Isabel's work.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this podcast so far, the second half of the conversation is available on Patreon, part of the Backroom exclusive podcast for patrons only. Some of the most interesting conversations I've had have been in the Backroom exclusive podcasts. At this point, you get access to well over 75, I think, exclusive podcasts by becoming a patron. It's well worth it. You know, you can ask patrons in the Discord or patrons in the comments section. They'll tell you it's very much worth it. And it's also a way to support this show and what I do in the main channel. In fact, it's the main means by which this entire One Dime project makes any money. And frankly, I think compared to what you get in return for becoming a patron of a lot of other YouTube channels, it's a lot more worth it to become a patron of this one. So see you in the back room and see you in the Discord.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimists, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.